Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome again to AJ 102. This will be the audio lecture for Chapter 4, and we're going to be focusing on contemporary policing, basically an overview. And before we get started on this, I think it's fitting that we take a second and we carve out a piece of the law enforcement code of ethics. As a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve the community, to safeguard lives and property, to protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, and the peaceful against violence or disorder, and to respect the constitutional rights of all to liberty, equality, and justice. Now, that's just a, excuse me, very small snippet from the Code of Ethics, but you can really see how detailed that information can get and the burden on law enforcement to be able to accomplish all that. So in this chapter, kind of at a glance, we are going to look at why we have police and what the police do. Next, we're going to have a little discussion on how policing relates to the people, followed by a look at the basic goals of policing and organization of law enforcement agencies, looking at some of the different pieces that make up the agency. Towards the end, we'll have a very quick discussion on the image of the police and public satisfaction and most importantly, confidence in the police. And we're going to discuss this more in other chapters, but we're going to touch on it just a little bit as we start to kind of move forward through this. So by way of introduction, when you look at the slide here, so the police represent the presence of the civil body politic in everyday life. The police role conveys a sense of sacredness, or awesome power. And the police represent the capacity to deter citizens from committing acts that threaten the order that they are believed to symbolize. So when you look at why we have police, and that would be a really good place to start, why do we have police? Why does our modern society now really need police? And you think about that. Why might you call the police? What if a neighbor's barking dog kept you awake night after night and you complained to the neighbor, but they kind of ignored you? There are things that you can do. Perhaps you could sue them, but it takes time and expense and things like that. You can't go over the top and go next door to your neighbors and shoot the dog, so because then you could get sued. So basically, there's another option, and I know that's kind of a small, weird analogy, but society really, for all these problems, offers all of us another option for those things, whether they're disputes or actual criminal acts. The option is, hey, you know what, we can call law enforcement. And in our society, the police have the authority to do something and to do it right away. So it's not like some big, long, drawn out court process. There are things that we can do. Sometimes the things that law enforcement do may involve some type of coercive force, meaning that in order to deal with something, they might have to assert their authority or use force. It kind of depends on the situation. In some, however, the role of the police is to address all sorts of human problems when and insofar as their solutions do or possibly may require the use of force at the point of their occurrence. So, and that doesn't mean that cops go out there every single day and use force, but force could be something as simple as a verbal command, your command presence in uniform with a badge and a gun. And again, we'll talk more about that later on as we start to kind of move through the chapter. So, again, kind of really quick, why do we have police? Well, we do have the authority to do something right now. Sometimes it involves force and sometimes it doesn't. Um, the police can demand conformity to society's laws, meaning that if there's a law in the books, we can basically tell people they have to comply. And if they don't comply, then of course there is some type of penalty for noncompliance. So what do police really do? What is it that makes the general public think of law enforcement or of the law enforcement aspect of police work more often than the social service aspect, when approximately 9% of a police officer's time is spent solving people's problems, more of a social service function? And that's really true. The best police officers are, in fact, those that can listen very intently and be able to communicate with others. And we do spend a lot of time solving problems. It's not like what you see on TV, all the time, where we're just out there, jumping fences and catching robbers and doing everything like that. And it doesn't mean that we don't do that, but um, we do have this huge social service function. Most people have the idea about what the police do. According to Manning, an author that writes in your textbook, 1997, to police means, in the most general sense, to control by political means the behavior and morality of the members of a politically organized unit. Now, stay with me for a minute. The sense of the word was derived early from the Greek word polis, with P-O-L-I-S, meaning city, later on roughly translated to the word that looks like politics, P-O-L-I-T-I-C-S. Policing in the sense means controlling, monitoring, correcting misguided behavior, tracking and altering it, if required, public conduct. Policing also refers to the tasks that people expect the police individually and in the aggregate sense to perform for them. So, there are people that have these ideas on what law enforcement's all about, and really until you've been in it, you kind of really don't know. So are the police primarily crime fighters, or are they preservers of peace? And the answer kind of varies from department to department, but realistically, police serve both functions. So now there is a higher emphasis on community policing and being part of the community, and trying to keep the peace more than just being the hard line, black and white. You break this law, here's the fine, or you get arrested. So keep in mind, though, that law enforcement officers, the police, they derive their power from the citizens, um, and we are accountable to them in a sense. And we'll talk a little bit more about authority, later on down the line here. So when you look at policing and authority, we just kind of talked about it a second ago. Police authority comes from the people. Their laws and institutions. Although the 10th Amendment reserves police power for state and local governments, these governments must adhere to the principles of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, as well as to federal and state statutes. So police agencies are not only part of their local community, but they are also part of state and federal government, which through legislation provides their formal base of authority. And I'm not going to go into the penal codes that really talk about that, but that's kind of where you glean your authority. Police are also part of state and federal criminal court system, which through the courts determines society's course in deterring lawbreakers and rehabilitating offenders. So, we're part of this large criminal justice system. And the goals and priorities of a police agency, though, just kind of keep this in mind, are in fact largely established by what the community wants. So A lot of times in law enforcement, we think we know what everybody wants. You call us, we solve your problems, we know what you want, and that's it. But sometimes we need to learn to listen a little bit to really understand what people really want. Um, that's really where departments become successful, when they understand what the community's concerns are and what the communities are really looking for. The people largely determine the goals of policing. We talked about that, and give law enforcement agencies their authority to meet these goals. So, in essence, citizen support is extremely vital. So, we've got these different places that we glean our authority to, but sometimes the authority, um, is legislative, and sometimes, then you separate that from where the community basically has goals that they want you to accomplish. And that's why working together, you can work within those written guidelines and still accomplish the goals of whatever it is that your community really needs. So moving on a little bit, we're looking at traditional goals of policing. Um, the basic goals we kind of know. They're enforcing laws, that's one. Preserving the peace, preventing crimes, protecting civil rights and civil liberties, and providing services. All of these things are the basic goals that most police agencies do. And when you talk about enforcing law, um, the designation law enforcement agency underscores the central importance of this long accepted goal. Historically, enforcing laws has been a prime goal of policing. However, this goal has become very complex. Unfortunately, because police are the component of the criminal justice system that really has the closest contact with the public, they are often blamed by the public for failures in the entire justice system. So an example could be, and it's in your textbook on page 122, an assault victim whose attacker is found not guilty in court may feel resentment towards not only the court but also the police department. Right or wrong, the release of a suspect from custody for lack of sufficient evidence, or failure of a prosecutor to take the case to trial, or failure of the correction system to reform a convict prior to parole or release, all directly affect the public image of policing. So, that's, we're kind of in the middle of it, if you will. So, when you talk about enforcing laws, that's a very important concept. And along with this, because each community and each state has numerous statutes and limited resources, full enforcement of all laws really isn't ever possible. Even if it were, it's questionable whether full enforcement would be in keeping with legislative intent or the people's wishes. And that's where this term discretion comes in. Discretion, that is, judgment, must be exercised as to which laws to enforce. Both the department and the public must accept that not all laws can be enforced at all times. And discretion can be anything as small as a traffic ticket where they pull you over and they decide not to give you a ticket. That's discretion. Or maybe even giving you the ticket. So the freedom of an agency or individual officer to make choices as to whether to act, that is discretion. And a lot of times, law enforcement, almost all the time we use discretion in that. Moving on to preserving the peace, has also been accepted by police as an important goal. They have the legal authority to arrest individuals for disturbing the peace or for disorderly conduct. The fine line between obnoxious behavior that infringes on other people's peace and harmless antics that merely defy standards of good behavior is easily crossed. Neighborhood residents may be annoyed when teenagers hang out on the streets and people walk down the city sidewalk, may be disturbed by activities or people passing out political flyers or things like that. So understanding again that our law enforcement's job is to preserve the peace, but to make sure that we're being fair um, on both sides. So, and sometimes that's a little bit tough. Preventing crime. If you could totally prevent crime, you would be the most sought after individual ever, because it's not as simple as it looked. Crime prevention is closely related to law enforcement and peace preservation. If the peace has been kept, crime has, in effect, been prevented. We'll talk more about that. Crime prevention differs from peacekeeping and law enforcement in law enforcing in that it attempts to eliminate potentially dangerous or criminal situations. So it's more proactive. If the police are highly visible in a community, crimes may be prevented. For example, a routine patrol might not only discover a crime in progress, but also prevent crimes from being committed. So it's really important that your law enforcement organization or you as a police officer establish a good rapport with the area that you might be assigned to, so that way you can really understand what's taking place in the area, the beat where you work, or the community as a whole. A crime prevention partnership between many communities often provides police departments what it really needs. It helps aid in crime prevention. So just as police officers cannot be expected to enforce all the laws all the time, they can't be expected to prevent all crimes from occurring. That's really difficult. You can't do that. There are calls that are coming into the dispatch center and you're being dispatched to calls, and maybe you see some observations, and all of this stuff is kind of a very fluid, ongoing situation. So you can't be everywhere at one time. Real quick, protecting constitutional rights. Not only are departments charged with enforcing laws, preserving the peace, and preventing crime, but they are also expected to do so as specified by the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The first paragraph of the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics concludes with the statement that law enforcement officers have a fundamental duty to respect the constitutional rights of all to liberty, equality, and justice. And we're going to talk more about the perception of how law enforcement is right now and the times that we're in right now. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And then, of course, providing services. In addition to enforcing laws, preserving the peace, preventing crime, protecting civil rights and liberties, the police are often called upon to provide additional services to their community. So, the role is acknowledged in the first sentence of the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics, the police officer's role. As a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve the community. Many police departments have as their motto to serve and protect, and if you look on the side of a police car, it's got their motto: committed to community, protect and serve, whatever that is. So there are a lot of different things that law enforcement does, other than just what you see on TV. They're always the first on scene at a medical situation where they may have to render first aid or CPR. Natural disasters, tornadoes, hurricanes, fires, earthquakes, they're always on scene at those. Community programs, all of the city programs that go on, law enforcement is deeply involved in all of those types of things. So, when you look at the entire plethora of things that cities do, you'll always see law enforcement deep rooted in there. Homeland security issues, again, something else that law enforcement is directly involved in. So all of these types of things impact your law enforcement agency. Moving on to contemporary goals resulting from community policing, and we'll kind of take a few minutes and talk about community policing. Police departments that have implemented what they call the community policing philosophy, forming proactive problem-solving partnerships with the citizens they serve to create a healthy, crime-free environment, still place importance on the traditional goals of law enforcement. However, most departments have also established two new important goals. First of all, community policing is a philosophy that emphasizes a problem-solving partnership between the police and the citizens in working toward, solving that problem or maintaining a healthy crime-free environment. That's also called neighborhood policing, but it's also called community policing. Goals resulting from implementing community policing usually include forming partnerships, as we just kind of talked about, with the community, and a proactive problem-solving approach to crime, fear of crime, and crime prevention. So a real good example to do, and I can go through it pretty quick, is let's say that you have a bunch of ATM robberies going on in your city. And instead of just focusing on and being reactive, somebody gets robbed and you go out there, you take the report, you get the information. Think about how you could deal with that situation on a more proactive basis. How would you look deeper to the root cause of the problem to see if you could eliminate it? Drug dealing was one thing that we dealt with a lot in the city where I came from early on when I took over as police chief. And way back when, yes, I'm going to show my age here, but they had like phone booths, and I know that most of you know what a phone booth is. And all the drug dealers would hang out in front of the liquor stores at the phone booth. Well, somebody got the idea, and this is like community policing at its best, looking at the root cause. Well, if you get rid of the phone booths, then they can't hang out there, and that's exactly what we did. So we started to remove phone booths, partnering up with the stores and the phone company, and as we removed those phone booths and possibly relocated them somewhere else, these people couldn't hang out and sell their drugs. So that's just a very quick example of things like that. So now we're going to move on to organization of the department. Departments vary in size greatly. There are very small departments from 2 or 3 officers to large departments with 7,000 or 8,000 officers. So the nation's police departments vary greatly from small, informally organized departments with few employees to highly organized metropolitan police departments with many subdivisions and thousands of employees. The specific organization of a police department is influenced by the department's size, location, and the extent and type of crime that it has to deal with. For example, small police departments often combine patrol, traffic, and community services and investigative tasks in a single division. Larger departments would have a separate unit for each. So if that kind of makes sense. So a department like the Los Angeles Police Department that is really big would have a lot of different divisions inside of it, and a lot more employees. And along with that, you have to understand this word at the bottom of the slide here, span of control. Span of control describes the number of individuals or resources that one supervisor can manage effectively during emergency response or special events. So, basically meaning how many people can you have to properly supervise in order to get things done. That would be a span of control. And when you start looking more at the structure of an organization, it is kind of a pyramid shape, and I don't know if maybe I'll put in one of my own department org charts and you can kind of take a look at it. But if you look at the top, you have top management, the chief, middle management, captains, lieutenants, first line supervisors would be sergeants or non-sworn supervisors, and then line staff would be officers. And that's typically how an organization kind of looks. When you kind of divide it out a little bit more, and we won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can look here, this breaks it down more. When you look at organizations of departments, typically the chief at the top, and there's usually 2 divisions minimum. Larger departments have quite a bit more, but here you have an example of field services. So you look at those out in the field, patrol, community services, traffic, investigations. Administrative services, more of the administrative side of the house, if you will. Recruitment and training, records, planning and research, technical services. So you can see how those are kind of divided. Here, actually, I do have one. I didn't know I did. It's kind of a breakdown of what my Rialto Police Department, what the staffing level looked like, and where things kind of kind of fell. So kind of the same thing. We called it Operations Bureau on the left, and on the right was Support Bureau. So you could see there was a captain, then below that are many, many other divisions that kind of go in line. So you can take a look and kind of look at that. But larger organizations such as this one, you can see where everything is kind of laid out specifically. Again, administrative services covers more of the support functions. And sometimes, here it has communications. Well, that could be under field services. It's kind of an organizational choice. There's nothing set in stone, but typically the admin services are exactly that, more administrative or support in nature as opposed to field services. So the examples they have here: support, communications, dispatch, records, things like that are all under here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on pinging of phones and things like that. There is some information that talks about communications in your textbook, and we'll go over that a little bit more. One thing I did miss here when you talk about support and current information, communication, the communication center in a police department is the heart and soul of an agency's operations. Although some agencies maintain their own in-house communication service or dispatch center, which we did, smaller agencies sometimes contract out or they share dispatch centers. But, just like patrol, that big field service patrol division is the backbone of the police department, the communication center is the heart and soul of an agency's operation. Also, when you talk about communication and being able to get information out and things like that, there's a lot of information on different communication devices. We now have mobile data terminals, basically computers in the cars. We have smartphones. We have all of these cool things that maybe we didn't have, quite some time ago. But still, one of the best ways that you can get information is through roll call training. So current information is usually provided at roll call training or by radio, by phone, by computer, but the roll call training, one of the most important functions of the admin division in its support of other units, is keeping members informed daily about police operations, providing administrative instructions, special assignments, tasks to be performed, and a lot of that stuff is done at what they call briefings or roll call, where officers get together at the beginning of their shift to be updated on all of the criminal activity, calls for service, and other essential things that are taking place, during the day. So that's really an important thing, and I want to make sure I didn't miss that. Field services, we know, is the other side of the house, basically. So that's patrol, traffic, investigations, specialized officers. When you look at different things like SWAT or canine or narcotics, all of those gangs, all of those might fall under that field services envelope. If you go back a little bit and you look at Rialto's, you can see that, we had the Operations Bureau, which is the same as field services. So you had patrol on the left. You can see dispatch was under operations. We had air support. We had SWAT. And then the specialized units are detectives, narcotics, SCAT, which is our street crime or gang unit, and traffic. So you can see everything that falls underneath that particular area. So finishing up a little bit with police culture, and we're going to talk more again in a couple other chapters, but I want to make sure that we kind of get this information in. We're not exactly, what's a good way to put it? The law enforcement, basically, its perception kind of ebbs and flows. So, some years we have good years where there's not a lot of media hype on law enforcement. And then sometimes we kind of go through these times where things aren't quite as good. And right now, I think we are a little bit under the microscope. And we're going to talk about body cameras and use of force and stuff down the line. So we're just going to talk about culture, kind of. So I'm not going to leave that out. I'm not going to tap dance around it, but we're going to hit more on the culture. An organizational culture refers to any group demonstrating specific patterns of behavior that distinguish it from others within a society. Organizational culture is derived from customs, from values of the organization's history, and how the organization's members interact with one another. and with those outside of the organization. Policing has been identified as having an organizational culture, which even the military does and other professions do, commonly referred to as the Blue Brotherhood. And you'll hear that phrase, the thin blue line, and things like that. So stay with me. Police officers work nights and weekends, deal with highly confidential material that can't be shared with friends, must enforce laws impartially even when a friend or relative violates the law, and frequently face public hostility, abuse, name calling, and biased reporting in the media. Because, the media helps us, but they're not always our friends. An additional bonding feature not commonly found in other professions is the willingness and readiness of officers to risk their lives for one another. A combination of these factors largely accounts for the existence of this police culture, meaning that when we hear gunshots, we don't run away from them, we run to them. So our job is we put our lives on the line every single day that we're out there to ensure that everybody else can, live the American dream or what have you. So when you do that for a long time, you develop a brotherhood, a sisterhood, whatever you want to call it, that's that culture to where, you'll do anything for your comrades. Another phrase used to describe the police culture is the thin blue line, a metaphor that places police officers in the blue as the element that separates an orderly, lawful society from one of chaos and crime. So a lot of times you'll see that little, and I don't think there's a picture of it here. It's like a rectangle. It's black, but it's got the blue line going through the middle. That's the symbol of law and order that runs through the middle of kind of chaos. And individuals who become police officers commonly lose their non-police friends within a few years. So that's one of the things about getting into law enforcement. When people know that you're a law enforcement officer, sometimes they kind of fade away a little bit. You're working all these weird hours. You've got all these other pressures that are going on. The media is hyping everything up. And sometimes, who were your friends may not be your friends later on down the line. In addition to losing their non-police friends, officers may also come to realize that they are now part of a group kind of isolated from the rest of society, a fellowship united by risk, hardship, and fear. Understand, it doesn't mean that you don't have friends, okay? And that it's an us against them society. What it means is that you develop an understanding because your job 24/7 involves risk, fear, and hardship. And sometimes that's hard for people to kind of understand. So hopefully that I kind of explained that okay. Basic styles of policing, and again, we're going to talk about other use of force stuff down the line, but I kind of wanted to get this through. Let me also kind of interject here. The us versus them attitude, common in some departments, can lead to defensiveness exhibited in such ways as reluctance to give up traditional police responsibilities or reluctance to explain their actions to citizens, which kind of is why we're rotating back around, or that pendulum is swinging back around more to a community-based style of policing, because the job really isn't just to go out there and crush crime, it's to build relationships and build partnerships. And so much for that. Styles of policing. Varieties of police behavior. A classic study published over 30 years by James Q. Wilson described 3 distinctive styles of policing. The legalistic, the watchman, and the service style. Many studies since then have looked at styles of policing and have classified these styles kind of into clusters or typologies, if you will. Few police officers fall completely into a single category, but the basic styles include like enforcer, crime fighter, social service, or watchdog. So the enforcer, focuses on social order and keeping society safe. Enforcers are less concerned with individual rights and due process. Such officers are often critical of the Supreme Court, politicians, police administrators, etc. As enforcers have little time for minor violations of the law or for the social service aspect. So that's kind of the enforcer. The crime fighter is like the enforcer in that the primary goal is to keep society safe. These officers tend to deal with all laws and all offenses equally. Okay, the social service agent is more accepting of the social service roles that law enforcement is involved in and more attuned to due process. Such officers are often young, well-educated, and idealistic. Like the enforcer, the crime fighter, the social service agent is also interested in protecting society, but more flexible in the approach. The watchdog, on the other hand, is at the opposite end of the spectrum from the enforcer. The watchdog is interested in maintaining the status quo, not making waves, etc. And you can look at more on, in your book on how that goes. So you can really see the differences on how you try to balance being a law enforcement officer and try to put yourself in these styles here and figure out which one you might be. Now, policing is greatly influenced by the person's personality, of course, but more to be said on that later. So the police image, and we're going to brush over this because we only have a few more minutes. Each police officer is an individual. Police officers are fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, uncles, aunts, coaches of little league teams, church members, and neighbors. As people, they like to be liked, but often their profession requires that they take negative actions against those who break the law. As a result, they're often criticized for and berated for simply doing their job. Although police officers are individuals just like those in the community, they have sworn to serve and protect. Their behavior is very public. The public's image of the police varies greatly. Some see police officers as protectors. Others see them as kind of militaristic individuals. The right of a police officer arouses feelings of respect, confidence, and security in some, and fear, hostility, and even hatred in others. And you can see basically by what happened in Dallas this last week on the 6 officers that were killed that yes, there is hatred out there. The police image results also from the media portrayal of law enforcement officers, from everyday contacts between police officers and citizen. So, I mean, those everyday contacts can have a positive or a negative, image on policing. Factors that influence the police image. Let's see here. Let me make sure we go here. Okay. Factors that influence the police image, are many. The nature of police work. Many demands are placed on police officers. They are under constant pressure and faced with rapidly changing conditions, sometimes life-threatening situations, sometimes with little supervision, little time to react. They have to make split-second life-altering decisions. Sometimes they have to think on their feet and play it by ear. Police officers have to interact with people from all walks of life who are involved in criminal and non-criminal activities and must use broad discretion in a wide variety of situations. They deal with crimes already committed and with people who are hurt, confused, angry, and upset, yet officers must remain neutral, calm, and objective. Well, you try to do that. It's not as simple as it seems. They may appear indifferent or unsympathetic, but much like physicians, they can't really become personally involved. So, this leads into stereotypes where people are sometimes suspicious of the police, view them as strictly authoritarian, and sometimes, I'm just going to use the word, sometimes brutal. The police deal daily with criminals, complainants, and citizens who may be cursing, yelling, lying, spitting, fighting, drunk, high, angry, irrational, demanding, manipulative, or cruel. Some officers' reactions to these daily encounters and the negative personality traits displayed may result in all officers being stereotyped as suspicious, cynical, indifferent, authoritarian, or even brutal sometimes. So, you know, there's a lot of different things there, and I'm not going to give you the definitions of all those words I just gave you. I'll let you kind of, go through there. When you talk about kind of, rounding things out here, there are a lot of studies that talk about satisfaction in the police, and satisfaction levels are generally high. Sometimes satisfaction was found to be shaped by demographic variables. The majority of the time, race was not found to directly determine satisfaction levels. But again, I'm not going to sit here and say that there aren't some officers that don't deserve to be cops, because there are. I think that in law enforcement now, it's a little bit of a challenge, and we've always made it through and done things well, but satisfaction levels have pretty much been pretty well up there, but not with everybody. So that's really, we're coming at the 40-minute mark. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of stop there. In summary, for this chapter, police are necessary when coercion is required to enforce the laws. We kind of talked about that. Concern for crime control must be balanced by the concern for due process. That's a tough one. Most police departments are organized into those two big basic units that I kind of showed you. There are 4 basic styles of policing, or how they portray law enforcement officers. And police image is a result of media portrayal, and again, sometimes they do well for us, the media, and sometimes they don't. So that's going to be the end of this particular thing here. I have an article at the end of this one that you can kind of look at. And this kind of shows you the nature of police work and how difficult law enforcement can actually be. So with that being said, that's going to be it for chapter 4. And of course, if you have any questions regarding this, you can post it on the general question Blackboard discussion board. All right, we'll take care, and I will be back with you again next week.